Hello, bonjour, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I am Paul Vixie from AWS Security. I think most of you know AWS is the Amazon Web Services. I've been here about a year, and I have some things to share about the evolution of cloud security. And hopefully I'll provoke some discussions either here for question and answer or in the hallways afterward. So, first,
tout d'abord, je pense que nous devons reconnaître que
it was a traditional network that preceded the cloud, and that traditional network is still in broad use, and it has some different security provisions, some different properties than what you will get in a cloud. And so I want to sort of jump off from the point of view of 2 or 3 decades ago when there was no cloud. The first thing is about networking. If you want to connect a network, you build a network, then you find some way to connect it to the rest of the networks in the internet. That could involve any number of different details, but only a few of those are security relevant. So if you have constructed and connected your own network, you have a monitoring burden, which will be around the clock if your business needs to operate around the clock. There will be denial of service attacks, and sadly, some of those will come from inside of your networks. This is inevitable because of the extreme number of devices being issued into the internet-connected market, the IoT. When you are responsible for a DDoS, the victims of that DDoS need someone to call, and you will have to find a way to be reachable in that way, lest you suffer disconnection. There's also congestion, either natural growth of your network or because of inbound or outbound attacks. You'll have to provision for that because you can't necessarily stop every attack. And this is a burden that will disappear in the cloud because that is something the cloud is going to do for you, all of those things. And the next part of the past, how we got here, is DNS. And I have some experience with DNS. And I know that it is sometimes necessary for a business to operate their own DNS infrastructure. This is especially true of, say, social networks or content delivery networks. The highly technical network operators need to keep their DNS close to home because it may involve very specialized software that they've developed in-house, or it may require in-house integration. If you don't have a business which requires that level of integration with DNS, you're probably better off to let your cloud operator, or if you have an ISP, let your ISP or some other party do this, because the same things come up again. DNS servers are, in many cases, perfect DDoS amplifiers because DNS is connectionless, and when you send someone a request, they're going to answer with something larger than the request. And that means your DNS servers, if you're operating your own servers and you have provisioned them well so that they can tolerate inbound attacks, that means that attacks that are simply bouncing off of your servers on their way to some other victim will be helped by your name servers. And so again, there is a monitoring burden, and there are some other details that will come into this. But just having the cloud as a way to provision your enterprise services, to put your assets online, will move these burdens into someone else's camp. And that's where we can then begin to talk about special advantages, security advantages of the cloud, some things that the cloud makes possible that would be either impossible or expensive or difficult to do with your own private cloud or your own private enterprise infrastructure. So first, I'll describe the virtual private cloud, which is what we at AWS use to allow a customer's assets to have different connectivity. In other words, some of your assets in our cloud, you're going to want to have be reachable by the world, others you won't. You will want many of these assets to be reachable from your own virtual services, but you will want to control that on a case-by-case basis. If you're going to do that in a pre-cloud environment, you'll be programming firewalls, which has a long tail of cost. So what this means for us is that your serverless, your servers, your storage, your key management, everything that you need in order to run your business will be as if it was on a cloud by itself, and will only be reachable to the world or to other customers of that cloud if you specifically choose to make it so. So when we talk about reachability, I'm somewhat proud of what we have achieved here to have a global network that is as strong as this one. When a customer of AWS decides sort of how to provision, they'll have to pick availability zones in different regions and say, we want to have direct reachability to this economy in a certain country, certain region. And that's, we have a lot, and so you can really pick and choose. It is often a good idea to be in several different time zones, just the same way that you might have your own monitoring team, your own network management or service management team in multiple time zones. But beyond that, we have connected every one of our data centers to over 400 points of presence around the world. And so everything you do from this cloud will be highly available with fine-grained peering and connectivity to other local networks in the regions that you've chosen. And this is, again, an expense that almost no enterprise would choose for themselves, but you get this benefit from the cloud, and that in turn will reflect in reachability of your assets. Next, I'd like to talk about Nitro. Nitro was a solution that we did not know was needed 2 or 3 decades ago when Amazon first created its cloud services. Rather, we learned from what happened with what we built and who our customers were and what their pain points were. We recognized that traditional virtualization had some risks. In particular, it had risks from its own operator. Not that AWS lacks confidence, but rather we understand that the need for confidential computing includes the need for confidentiality from the cloud operator. And so some customers in decades past said that they were reluctant to move certain workloads to the cloud because they didn't understand how we would secure their workload, how we would secure the hypervisor, which is what gives each virtual system its own environment. So with careful consideration, a lot of planning and a big investment, we built hardware specific to this purpose. And then we built our own virtualization hypervisor, and we made sure that the whole thing was designed so that even we could not violate the security perimeter. And this, of course, was difficult, and it was innovative, and I wish we could have foreseen it sooner and built it sooner, but instead we built what we built, we learned what we learned, and then we built more. We're going to keep doing that, by the way. So to give you an idea of where Nitro sits, it is either some chips on a motherboard or it is a PCI card of some kind. And it presents to the guest virtual storage interfaces, virtual network interfaces. So the guest is no longer seeing a strictly software construct when a guest operating system boots up. It is seeing things on its own I/O bus and in its own memory space, which are actual devices which are created by the Nitro circuitry. And that gives us the ability to encrypt everything that guest will do, even if the guest is unaware of the encryption. If you access this network through the Nitro, which is your only way out of a Nitro system, it's going to encrypt that as it passes over our network, and same thing when you access storage. It's always been possible for your apps, your services to encrypt in an explicit way, written into the code, your own key management and so forth. And that remains possible, there's nothing to prevent it. But this is a way to get the benefit of essentially anti-surveillance without even knowing, without caring. You're aware of it, but you don't have to participate directly. Now, furthermore, that hypervisor is not a normal, let's say, Linux kernel with shells and libraries and things. It is a very small, very well-reviewed piece of software that simply has no way to log into it. The best way to avoid an attack is to not have that attack surface. And so the traditional ways in which you might break into a hypervisor, you could maybe guess an SSH password or do some kind of a 0-day against some service. Well, there are no services. You can't connect to it. It has no reason to connect to anyone. And that in turn means we can only communicate with it through the API that it offers. And that API is very small and very tightly controlled, very well logged. And some of the things that maybe were concerns before Nitro disappear in this case. There is no way to copy out the memory of a guest in order to extract key material or other confidential material that the guest may be processing inside of its operating system with its own processes. So again, this is all done without the need for the guest operating system or your service to be aware. It was just our way of putting customer data behind a perimeter that was so strong not even we could penetrate. Now, in addition to that, we created the idea of a Nitro enclave. And here, the idea is to be able to boot some code inside this enclave, which has strong security properties. For example, it has been crypto authenticated, right? It will not boot unless the signatures of the software it would boot were generated with the key that is authorized to generate them. So if there were some way to violate the code base of that enclave so that next time it booted, it would be running code that maybe the owner doesn't know about and would not have approved of, that won't work, because the only way to get that code in there is through a sort of a very narrow path involving some very tightly controlled keys. The other security property of some importance is the enclave has no IP networking. It can only be reached from a Nitro instance. And so it's not something you could put a general purpose operating system on, but if you had some kind of very secure task that had to be performed in a way that you could prove that no one was observing it, you'd put it in here. And you could send the data in there and get some result back, and you'd be confident that the code that generated that was your code, and there's no persistent storage in there, so it really is meant for specific tasks requiring ultimate anti-surveillance. And to that end, it won't share a core on the operating system, excuse me, on the CPU chip. It will not share a core between an instance and an enclave. So to the extent that there may be a concern about side channel attacks or cache snooping attacks or whatever, that can't happen because the code will never have shared any memory or any cache or any core with any other code. Happy to discuss afterward if there are additional things that maybe we should shoot for in the future. But right now, this is our best guess about how to deliver confidential computing. Now I'd like to talk about Firecracker. At heart, Firecracker solves a problem which would otherwise prevent the use of certain security techniques. Right? Containers are almost an entire net win. They just, it is wonderful to be able to build your online services in an immutable fashion so that the container will start up when it needs to, perhaps triggered by one of our other services or perhaps triggered by one of your other services. The problem is containers are full Linux-style systems, and they take several seconds. Even, if you optimize the boot time as well as is possible, you're still going to be waiting a second or 2 seconds before, between when you want that service to be live in that container and when it actually is. So Firecracker is a tiny little microkernel that allows you to package up your container in a way that it will boot in 1/8 of a second, 125 milliseconds. And if you have a load spike and you're triggering the creation of a lot of these back to back, we could create hundreds per second on your behalf. And that in turn allows a given piece of server hardware to maybe have thousands or tens of thousands of these all running at the same time. So by making containers lightweight, we make it more likely that they will be used. Because the best security technology and the best security techniques might be ineffectual if they are too hard to use, if your teams avoid them because they can't tolerate the cost. So this simply extends the domain of containers into higher performance and performance-sensitive systems. So if you care about this sort of thing, the microkernel that is in use here is written in Rust, and it is open source. And we have encouraged the community to create sort of new plugins, new capabilities for this system. And what we hope in the long run is that this will evolve into what the future needs it to be. Now I'd like to talk about Graviton. So a number of companies, for example, this laptop is made by Apple, and it has a chip, the ARM chip. And ARM it's good technology. It's a RISC-based system. It's very low power. It's very high performance. But every ARM chip is a little different. So when Apple made this laptop, they took the ARM design and added certain things they needed for their customers. And we've done the same. Graviton is based on ARM, but it has various things that are in the chip over and above the ability to run the ARM instruction set and to execute code that was compiled for the ARM. And the things that I think are important is that every core has its own cache, and there is no shared cache at the level of the CPU chip itself. So again, this is as a result of highly public side channel attacks that we've witnessed, we think we've all witnessed, where if there's something that's in cache, then the speed with which it can be accessed will be different. And that is that's a leak. That means that multi-tenant systems may have some tenants able to access indirectly, or at least know what the data is that belongs to other tenants. That can't happen if every core has its own cache, but the chip has no shared cache. We also have pointer authentication. This is from the ARM version 8 design. And this simply means that when a pointer is stored in memory, some hidden bits are computed based on a private key. And if that pointer is later accessed and found not to have the right hidden bits, in other words, either no bits or the bits were computed improperly, it will result in a code fault. And none of us loves code faults, but we would always prefer a code fault to executing software that was delivered to us through a 0-day. So pointer authentication is extremely important. And the modern generation of ARM chips, including the Graviton 3, have memory encryption. And this is particularly tight encryption because the key is generated in hardware at power-up time, and there is no sequence of instructions by which that key can be extracted. Not by you as the guest, not by us as the hypervisor. There's simply no way to get the key out. But everything that core writes to memory will be symmetrically encoded with that key, and everything it pulls out of memory will be symmetrically decrypted. And this in turn means that if there were some data path by which the memory of a guest can be copied out, so that you can extract confidential information, what you would get is garbage. And that is, again, that's something our customers told us in the last 2 decades that these were concerns. And so we have moved in this direction. Yeah, these PCIe devices at the bottom of this picture, those are Nitros. The guests can't see the real PCI bus. They only see what Nitro chooses for them to see. Finally, I'd like to talk about some things we've done with S3. So S3 is our storage service. It's been very influential. We're very proud of it. And I can tell you as an AWS technical employee that the team who works on this is some of the smartest people I've ever met. But we had some difficulty over the years because some customers did not intend to create an open storage interface, a so-called bucket, but they did so by accident. And so in recent years, we have changed several defaults. For example, we have this BPA, block public access feature, which is on by default. And so no matter what you put or do not put into your access control list, you will not be reachable by the whole world anymore. And if you want to be reachable, we support that. You can turn off the BPA feature for your bucket. The next thing we did was encryption by default. So as of January of this year, every object that is uploaded to S3 will be encrypted either using a key that belongs to the S3 service or belongs to EC2 that's managed by the customer in some other way. And it will therefore have to decrypt the data when it is accessed. What that means, what's important about that, is that even if someone has, through some access control mistake, oversight, whatever, if somebody has access to the data, they won't be able to see it. They won't be able to do anything with it because they would also have to have access to the key that was used, the key pair that was used to encrypt it. And so there are 2 different things that must now be done, which are changes from the default in order that data stored in S3 somehow be readable by the wrong person, by anybody other than the right person, or the right services. All right. So what that means is, we would see T-shirts in the late 1990s that the cloud was just somebody else's computer. I don't think that was true then, but I know it's not true now, because the things I just described will probably never really appear in private clouds or in sort of small enterprise deployments or even medium enterprise deployments. It takes a long time to figure out exactly what you want to get the confidentiality that you need and to defend against the risks that you can enumerate. And that means the cloud is a lot more than just somebody else's computer. So this is our worldview, and this also has evolved over the course of decades. The part that is in yellow here belongs to us, and it is the cloud, and we are responsible for securing the yellow part. So we're going to make sure that the cloud you're in is secure, and then you, as the customer, as you bring workloads, are responsible for the security of that which is in blue. We've done all in our power to make security the default and to make it the easiest path so that you don't have to do extra work in order to secure the part that is the customer's responsibility. And we will innovate continuously to add more ways that your workloads can be secure. We'll do some in yellow, for example, the Nitro system or some of the S3 changes I've described. And we'll do more in terms of products and services to make it possible for you to secure the part that is in blue. But we believe in this shared responsibility model, and we take it very seriously. And that concludes my remarks, but I would deeply welcome questions. No one wants to start. I guess thank you all for coming. I hope to meet you in the hallways.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here for this workshop, notwithstanding the strikes today. I hope you didn't have too much of a hard time coming on Lille. My name is Sébastien Vieux. I've been for a few years to Storm Shield. I'm here with Pierre-Olivier Kaplan, who's the leader of our cell on cyber security and intelligence. We'll talk about our XDR Storm Shield platform, which is a very fashionable term nowadays. And we'll try and talk about our vision of XDR in Storm Shield. How do we conceive it and how? So obviously, we'll do a demonstration. We'll talk about some use cases. But first of all, why XDR? Why should we do XDR today? For Storm Shield, we've always had a protection approach. So the most important for us is not to have an impact on a system during a cyber attack. So is to protect as best as we can and to prevent the attack to go all the way till the end, avoid vulnerabilities and phishing of data. That's really an analysis that's based on behavior, whether it's on the firewall or on the boxing center with all the IA on the files, whether it's protection of the machine with EDR or on all the threat intelligence pipelines. So only to protect, we all know it, protection in its absolute, 100%. Well, the one who finds it, he will be really rich in cyber. We also have to be able to react when something takes place because the signals are not clear enough. Sometimes configurations are not well done on protection systems or other reasons. Attacks can go through. So obviously, there are sometimes when the protection is not the most efficient. For example, there might be a machine that is made a target. So obviously, there will be some attacks that will go through, even notwithstanding all our efforts. And we wanted to have a response to this. And we wanted to give our clients the ability not only to protect themselves, but also to react quickly and with respect to heterogeneous systems and complex systems in addition to the protection itself. So how do we do this? We do it through this platform that uses all our products. I talked about it. Our firewall is an MBR, which is in audit mode. Our system protection is an EDR. Our boxing system is a file DR. And our intelligence system gives us a lot of data that allows us to detect. All of this we will orchestrate it and enable it to work through our SLS, which allows us to monitor and manage the events, and will become a SOR at the end of the year. And we will manage different incidents, security incidents, through this solution. So it's best to have a demonstration instead of having a long speech. So let's go straight to the point with a specific case. It's a business called Incredible Data. It's an intelligent company with a portal that allows small companies and managers to input some data and to work with it. So it's very simple. We might have an MFA on the login. It's a Java element. It's a Java portal. The architecture is standard. This is the demonstration. On one side, the attacker, the social networks. Always important for the attackers to have a social networks to have basis for an attack. Then you have the NDR firewall, which is protected, which is perhaps not configured very well, be it between the Exchange server and the frontal server. On the server, you have EPP and EDR, and the management, XDR management. We haven't talked about SAS with all the elements. Here is the very simple architecture. Obviously, this is just a demo. The scenario here, we will have all the different steps of the attack. So the discovery, collected discovery. So looking for information on social media on the targets. This is very important to have a quality attack, to have a scan, to see if there are any vulnerabilities, what is the system, what's its version, what we can use on it. Exploitation in itself of the vulnerability. It will be a Log4Shell, which hasn't been corrected. Obviously, transferring some invasive tools of the hacker. Pierre-Olivier will talk about it, a small meta-exploit. Lateralization, which is really essential. Internal scan, what's in the network, what can be used. Finding a new vulnerability, Microsoft, because there are quite a few of them. Proxy logon. Deleting all the traces, it's always done in an attack. Exfiltration, always before encrypting, we have some exfiltration of data. And finally, execution. The cyber attacker will launch his attack, and it will go on the totality of the stations. And Pierre-Olivier, I will let you show us the dream. We go on the right screen with the video. Thank you, Sébastien. I suggest to do this APT attack together. We will follow the attacker through his eyes, but not only. We will also look at the administrator that through the XDR system will be able to receive the information immediately and apply the remediation. So here we have the initial situation. So the eyes of the attacker. The attacker was able to steal an email address of one of the employees of Incredible Data through the social networks, and he's discovering this web portal that is on the net. But you agree, Pierre-Olivier, he only copied the address, the email address, not the account. Yes, only the email address. So there he is. He's discovering the portal, and the first thing he will do is an automatic scan of vulnerabilities, and then we go to the serious stuff. Log4Shell, and he will try to activate it on the web server. He injects his command and attacks the server. And here the server responds. The server fell in the trap, and he has now hand on the server. Obviously, on the administrator side, we have received an email from the XDR saying that the system is compromised. So the administrator runs on the Storm Shield log supervisor of XLS, and he will be here on the main dashboard. And on the left, he will have the confirmation that he has one serious event. And first of all, he will look at the main dashboards of SLS to review the recent security activity. So these are dashboards built on the alerts, on the firewalls and network activities, and on the workstations. So it will do its first revision. Then it will go in the incidents dashboards, and here you can see the incident. It says web server is compromised. That's it. It's there. And it's interesting because it can review the data of the incident, analyze them, and close them once the remediation has been done. So here, he will go analyze the data of this incident of the compromised web server, and he will access the following data. So what can we see here? On the left, first of all, you can see the source of the threat. So here is the IP address of the attacker. Then the score of the threat. Here it's very high. This is calculated on the severity of the alerts received, but it's also correlated with the engine of reputation that we have. So if the IP address of the attacker is known, this score will go up. And finally, on the right, you have a long list of alerts. These are linked to this incident in chronological order. And this is important because it allows the attacker to know what happened not the attacker. Oh, yes, sorry. I'm sorry. The administrator. Yes, the attacker already knows what he's doing. Yes. So you can see this list is quite long. Why is it so long? Because if you remember, the first action of the attacker was to launch a scan of vulnerabilities. And this was detected. This launched a bunch of alerts. And if we go at the very bottom, you will find the log4shell. And here the administrator knows. He knows that his server has been compromised in this way. Very well. Now, before going in a remediation action, we will come back to our attacker. Our attacker was able to infiltrate with an account, and now he wants to go further. And to go further, he needs to import his own tools locally to use in his future exploitations. So he's using this software called Ragnar Locker. As you know, maybe it's a ransomware, and this is a real ransomware, and this will be very useful for later on. So we analyze the local network, we try to go beyond, we'll scan the ports of the machine, and we analyze the results. What do we see? We see interesting things here. We see LDAP, Kerberos, and it looks like a Windows machine and an Active Directory. So obviously, it's a strategic server. Not only, there's also SMTP, IMAP. We think of messaging, perhaps Exchange. So it's a server that has several functions, a very bad practice, and it's very strategic, obviously. So it's very interesting for the attacker, especially because it's not up to date. Yes, it's true, it's not up to date. So this will be very useful for us because we will attack it using the vulnerability that targets Exchange, which is proxy urban. And it will use the tools that it brought already to try and exploit this proxy logon. It launches its tool, it's a very known tool, and it will choose the Metasploit, and it will choose the script that is corresponding to proxy logon. And he does that, and finally he configures his attack, and he puts in the IP address that will launch the attack, that will be attacked, and finally, for proxy logon, you need to have an email address of someone on the Exchange server. And wow, that works well because you remember the attacker at the beginning had managed to find one of the email addresses of someone. So he uses the email address roger.latest@incredibledata.local. Everything is ready for our attack. So we launch it. And the attack is successful. We are now on the Windows server. Immediately, the attacker pushes the ransomware on it. Here, I remind you, we've only uploaded the ransomware. We will deploy it later. Then we delete the logs, we cover our traces, we use the tool WebTutil that allows in Windows to cancel events in Windows. And finally, we'll try and steal some confidential data that we can use for blackmail or money or others. And we go into the full administrative folders, we go into documents, we have a look what's inside, and we see a folder that's called confidential. Looks very interesting. We'll look at it and we see that there are several docx files, so this is very good. If you have topology.x, we take it, download it, and here immediately for the poor administrator, there's a new alert, access to a forbidden file. So we will again analyze the details in XLS. Our alert appears here on the list of incidents that adds on to the list that we had before. And again, we will analyze here the data and we'll see some new things. What do we see here? First of all, on the left, you see the host that has been affected. Here, it's a WinServer 2012. Again, the threat score very, very high here. If you look all the way on the right, we have the list of alarm alerts that correspond to this. The first one is the PowerShell code that was detected as malicious, and it's a proxy logon and its activity. Then we have on the next alert, we have the WebTutil, and here the administrator sees, they're deleting the logs. And on the last alert, you see the theft of the file. PowerShell read the file topology.docx. So here the administrator knows what has been stolen and what has been affected. And he has all the information quite quickly. And the middle column, which is very interesting, is the strength of the correlation between the log SNS on the network side and the endpoint workstation side. Is we see the vector of how it's compromised. Sorry. Here we see the scan of the ports that have been done, and we find the proxy logon as well. And it's wonderful for the administrator because all the inquiry is already done. Everything's there. We don't need to go on each equipment to try and reconstitute the puzzle. And this is excellent for him so that he can remedy quite fast. And he can win some time. Yes, that's right. But before going to remediation, as you remember, the attacker had placed his ransomware on the machine. So the final step is to launch the ransomware. So he had placed the ransomware in the file directory, and he will connect again on his machine and give a last blow to incredible data. So the attacker here goes back to the root of the files, and he will launch ragnarlocker.exe, and it's done. And again, for the administrator, new alert with the data of the incident that we will analyze again. What do we see this time? Well, the host is still the same. The threat score is still the same one and very high. It's a ransomware. The compromission vector is the same as well because the path is the same. And finally, in terms of the alerts, the alarms, you have two that are linked to Ragnar Locker that has been detected by SES as dangerous and blocked. So at least we had this protection so that the ransomware cannot do too much. And here the administrator can proceed with the remediation. It will start, first of all, on the network side, on the SNS firewall, where it's connected, first of all, to limit the area of threat, its perimeter of action. So first of all, it was in NDR, and now it activates IPS, so that now the alarms can be reactivated and can detect Log4Shell, proxy logon, and scan for vulnerabilities and so on. Then we block the IP address of the attacker, which is quite classic, knowing that another solution can be to use the reputation IPs. If we know that this IP address already, we could use it like that as well. And finally, we isolate the compromised web server for two reasons. First of all, to prevent it to communicate with another server, and also to isolate it on the local network to limit the perimeter of damage. This was for the network. So here it's recreating the rule to isolate the compromised server. This is for the server. Then for the workstation, this will be for our SES system. So here what you can see, this is a Storm Shield endpoint security. This is the element that pilots all the SES engines of the business. And from here, it will find in the SES alarms the one that is linked to the Ragnarlocker ransomware, and here create remediation tasks. The first one is to restore the shadow copies, because before being detected, the ransomware was able to detect to encrypt some of the files, but luckily we're able to restore them so the files are not lost. So it's not bad. Whew. And then we instruct all the workstations to scan the system and delete all files, ransomware files. And so we delete every trace of compromising on the local network. So we've created these tasks and we activate it. This takes us at the end of the remediation. Perhaps the last word, in the counter fight, there are 3 stages to find, isolate, and eliminate. And thanks to XDR, the administrator was able to do it. Sébastien, back to you. Thank you, Pierre-Olivier, for this demo, very full of teachings. So what did we see on this demo? We saw the first version of the XDR Storm Shield XDR, because the second version, we will automate many of these answer response processes. Today you saw it manually, and tomorrow it will be automatic. Now, of course, be careful. For us in Storm Shield, the automatic XDR was something we're against, but it can prepare it, but launching it has to be done manually by the administrator. Because if we start having automatic reactions, we'll have some bad automatic reactions. So never replace the administrator. We saw the threat intelligence. We didn't really see the sandboxing in this example because we didn't have files, but it's also something that can work. We have seen this first element. We saw the endpoint security and the network security to detect, to orchestrate. We saw XLS with the log stalking and the alerting. The processes and playbook are for the end of the year. The response part, we are obviously on the protection of assets through endpoint. We can isolate an asset automatically, delete some registry keys, delete some files, kill a process, and so on, and restore the shadow copies, which is really essential. On the network part, what can we do? We can geo-localize the IPs that are coming in. We can include IPs of a SOC in our solution. We can activate IPS signatures that the Storm Shield team will have conceived as they have new critical detections, because most of them are detected and blocked by our pattern, but some of them are really subtle, so we continue working on this. And obviously, for a firewall, we can isolate assets. So this is the strategy for answer that we can suggest. What will we gain from this XDR process and solution? From a point of view of the final user, is the performance of the security, because it's security done by one and the same team. All these detection scenarios are done by the CTI team that is working on the SNS, on the CTI. It's a unified solution. Storm Shield really is creating all these products, and these are developed coherent between them, and it can be integrated, because here we're talking about some kind of closed XDR, because these are our solutions in our platform, but all our products have open APIs, and they can be piloted by other XDR third-party solutions, for example, Sequoia or Logpoint or others, and they can be piloted by third-party solutions, and this is important. We have one solution, tailored solutions, but if you have another solution, you can pilot it through your existing XDR. And it's part of the cybersecurity response in front of threats, because we can't just play in our own field, and we have to play with open books. And then we have pre-organized scenarios with some use cases that are quite current in threats. For example, the malicious USB key. Obviously, we find them every day on the floor. Perhaps not every day, but we find them regularly, and they have Trojan, and the Trojan will contact the command control to take over the asset. So we'll detect the fact that the USB key has been connected. There's a contact of the C2C. There's an abnormal behavior in terms of energy use, that we can isolate the process, kill the process. We can forbid this key, the USB key, on other machines so that it cannot be shared with other machines, so that its USB tag is forbidden, is blocked, its ID. This is for the USB part. We also have use cases of the web server that has a DDoS attack. So this was really network related, but it's interesting to write it down to see it, because we see there are some malicious IPs that are launch requests for the server. We see a burst in the SYN flood, for example, and we can respond and restrict the geographic IP and stop the malicious IPs, activate a specific QoS on the server to protect it. And by doing this, I respond on the long durability of the server, because this means that the server needs to be protected further. So we are on the virtuous circle of continuous improvement. Everything we do on the Storm Shield solutions to protect and react, as they are protection solutions, that's what they're done for. So there's a capacity to configure that allows us to leave these responses not to be affected again in the same way. So we leave them afterwards. So that's a way that we're able to improve our security. Finally, bouncing back on the local network, a machine that comes to connect that is not allowed and try to scan and exploit vulnerability on machines, on servers. Once again, it will be detected because we'll be able to scan it. We'll see the attempts of scanning because we have Yara scans on EDR. So we will see all of this, and the response, you've understood it, will create isolation rules. It's more efficient instead of killing the machine. If it's not managed, it's a bit more difficult. We will isolate it, but if it's a compromised machine that was managed, we will be able to completely turn it off. I had a last one as well. I wanted to leave time for questions. This is on an emailing with malicious files. So depending on the messages that we receive on the emails that give information and allow to react. So perhaps this file, if it hasn't gone through the sandboxing, if someone was able to open it, we're able to detect it, we're able to react on all the machines, on all the firewalls, and then we're able to block it and kill it where it went through. So in summary, it's a global solution that we really master in Storm Shield, and we can provide different detection scenarios that are quite accurate that can protect European companies. Why European? Because it's a European XDR sovereign solution. Cyber efficiency, because we have a power of detection and response that we continue to keep through components that are made to interact with each other because they're made by the same company. I would like to finish with our XDR strategy. And do you have any questions, technical or less technical? Yes. So through the alarms, we have the information on which machine was compromised and who communicated with whom and how. Sorry, the interpreter cannot hear the questions. Then the next scenario is listed in chronological order. So all the elements of how it's compromised, it's listed there, and you have to just follow what is indicated. This way you can retrace back every step. Yes, that's it. So you can see what happened recently and how he got there. All the previous alarms as well that brought to this incident. If the attacker was able to encrypt the data and also was able to take some data that were on the server, what is the reaction how do we react to this? For the encryption of the data, the SES system is really looking on the attempts of eliminating shadow copies of the server, so it can block that. And from shadow copies, you can then restore them. Then for theft, well, this is really a good example that shows that XDR it comes in addition to something else. It's not a solution for cyber attacks generally, because first of all, you have to protect it. Because if the data is stolen, well, that's it. That's where the impact is. So first of all, the information should be encrypted. That's why we have encryption solutions for folders and files, so that if they're stolen, they're unusable. But in this example of theft of data, if we weren't able to react faster, that's it. It's game over. There's nothing to be done. No, you should never pay for ransomware. Never pay. Can we launch a data encryption once you detect the first vulnerability automatically? It's a scenario that we've been thinking about, and from a technical point of view, today we can't do it, but tomorrow we will look into it and we'll do it, because as we have an encryption system, it would be a pity to not to be able to use it. It's a good question. No one else?
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you. A small question. You said that you don't like to automate everything, but let's take the example that many attackers are waiting for Friday night when no one is in front of the computer to be able to have time to launch their attack. In that case, even though it's bleeping everywhere, how can we work against this attack? This is a risk you have to calculate. Either you choose to respond automatically that says, well, it's the weekend, no one is there, I have no production. For example, maybe you imagine that you have no activity on the weekend, and perhaps the simple reaction say, well, I close internet because I'm not using it. And all other cases where there is a risk, and if there's someone is there to supervise, then the administrator receives it he's on call, so he receives it on a cell phone. The alert on his cell phone. In terms of behavioral analysis, I wanted to know if there is a time to learn for your system. Yes, there is an adaptation time, more in terms of configuration, but not learning. Other questions? With respect to this gentleman's question, can you, through the system, automatically cut the threat and prevent access, especially when you have a score that's 99 or 90 or so %? is it possible to automatically cut access to the attacker? As soon as the XOR version, as soon as the version with the XOR will come out, yes, it will be possible from a technical point of view. Then it's a matter of posture, but from technical point of view, it will be possible. What you have seen here is a completely manual remediation. So the administrator went on his equipment and assets and made the corrections. But obviously, this that we're looking to implement also completely automatic, that would fix itself, quote unquote. Yes? Yes. In that specific case, if the SNS detects the obviously here the scores are very high because they're known threats. If we work with lower scores and threats, then the scores are lower. Yes, that's correct. You're right. A quick question from the CTI on the PV, which is one of their major solutions. What do you use in terms of rules is it sigma base to block the PVI? Is it elements that allow you to detect and to block, or just to detect or just to block? So this is our team that's working on this. We have quite a few sources that we keep on monitoring to detect issues faster. We have Yara, not Sigma. We have IUC also that we're collecting through our own feeds. But I'm afraid that we're up with the time, so I see people are leaving to go to other sessions. We'll close the session here. Thank you for having listened to us, and have a good FIC.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable on the theme of multi-cloud, or the art to manage complexity. I'm Yvan French. I manage the cloud transformation team, WCP France. I'm delighted to coordinate this roundtable with 4 speakers. We've got Carlos Gonçalves, Global Chief Information Officer at the Société Générale, also a member of the CGF and its administrator. We also have here Vincent Roy, who's RSM security specialist at Splunk. Well, afternoon, everyone. We've got Denis Wendt, Principal Security Researcher for MasterCard from the US, and
talk with us.
And we also have Tobias Hölvart, who's CEO of Sourcing International.
To come in France. Welcome. Ceci étant dit,
having said this, I mean, we're going to deal with the multi-cloud situation. I mean, the roundtable will have a section dealing with some topics and dealt with by the 4 speakers. The idea is to define what the multi-cloud is, talk about the challenge and the complexity of having to deal with the multi-cloud situation and multi-cloud suppliers, different axes of discussion, and we'll close this session with 10 or 15 minutes of discussion where you can ask your questions. We've got French and English speakers at the table, so a part will be held in French, a part will be held in English. So you've got headsets for simultaneous translation, which works quite well. Channel 1 is French, channel 2 is to have English, so don't hesitate to get equipped with those headsets if you need simultaneous translation directly. Having said this, I mean, let's start maybe with a first question about what is the multi-cloud and why the multi-cloud? I mean, maybe Carlos, you want to answer this question first? I think that we can all answer this question, but the question of what is the multi-cloud, I mean, the way it was asked goes beyond public multi-cloud because very often we list the number of private cloud we've got, but we have mostly the hybrid cloud. I'm not talking about a startup or a company starting with cloud, but for mid-size or large company, we've got legacy, we've got private cloud, and we operate under different jurisdiction. So we've got an obligation to operate our own business, to have an internal cloud. And then we've got public cloud. So the complexity of what we have to manage are several different public clouds operating, interacting with one internal cloud. So the grand question is the security models we're going to have on all these clouds. How do they operate? The regulation we have to comply with in the different countries, and finally, the cost to operate a system which is as complex as a private cloud plus one or several public clouds. Thank you. Now, are there any differences now on the French territory or in Europe? I mean, is there an adoption of the multi-cloud situation? Are there any French specificity, Vincent? Yes, I mean, in France, I mean, we can take the metrics that we use, and we could say that 94% of our customers are very cloud, and generally it's five cloud suppliers for each of our clients. The more important our client is, the more multi-cloud solutions are provided. The specific case of the Olivet, because we could imagine that OIVs wouldn't go in the cloud. There was a determination to have a total sovereignty, especially for the national health system. The OIV part will be isolated in very small parameters and treated in a specific way, but there's going to be a dichotomy, and all the rest of IT will be hosted in the cloud. That's the specific French part. Okay.
And at the end, do we have the choice of multi-cloud? Can we, why we are going to the multi-cloud? Why we are going to multi-cloud? And is there any, drivers that oblige us, or do we have the choice at the end?
Yes, thank you. For many companies, there really isn't a choice, and I'd like to speak about some of the main drivers behind that. First of all, the business drivers. For my company, MasterCard, a lot of that comes around from acquisitions. We've had a lot of acquisitions over the last several years, many of which are newer companies that are cloud native. We don't want to just switch them over. They're already doing business in a particular cloud. And so we have to deal with that. The other second really driver is a regulatory driver. We're doing business in many countries across the world. Some of them have varying data localization regulations and that drive us to look for various multi-cloud providers. And the last one is a technical one, and that gets into the data and basically classification of the various data and the applications and the different security requirements for each of those. But one thing I would say, if there's not an overwhelming or driving reason for the business reason or regulatory reason or something, or true technical reason to go to multi-cloud, and we'll get into complexity later, there's probably something you shouldn't be looking at. I mean, unless there's something driving you to do it, multi-cloud for multi-cloud's sake, unless there's really some true requirement, I think will add far too much complexity.
Okay, thank you. And the last question about, yes, putting the perimeter is for Tobias, and Carlos mentioned that a little bit with the size of the company. But maybe Tobias, is there any also difference between companies to companies in these multi-cloud adoptions from your point of view?
Well, from my point of view, there are massive differences between companies, and they come from regulatory requirements or from business needs. So one of my customers is the Austrian Railway, and they have 5 areas. One is maintaining the railway infrastructure. So they try to avoid cloud as much as possible. Another part of that company is rail cargo. They are facing extreme international competition, so they are heavily investing into cloud services. One very extreme example is another customer who is a pipeline operator. They are transporting gas from Hungary border to North Italy. They are NATO protected. They fall under the NIS regulation. But because they had to be outsourced from a multinational gas organization for regulatory requirements about 8 years ago, they had the option of a greenfield approach. Do we build it? Do we do a full outsourcing? They decided to go to a 90% cloud serviced operations, which is very, very unusual for such a company, but for them it was the best solution at that time to ramp up an IT infrastructure as fast as possible. So yes, there are massive differences. Size-wise, yes, of course, small companies normally are a little bit easier in their decisions, and they have a sort of more flexible approach to the topic, whereas the larger organizations face more regulatory issues, more reputation damage, they have more legacy, and therefore they are a little bit more hesitating because they need to protect their operations.
Okay, thank you. And maybe, as you mentioned, yes, some companies are on the green field, and maybe big companies, it's a bit different. Do you have maybe, Carlos, some example from your big company? I guess multi-cloud, it's not green field. You have lots of existing softwares, and it might be a bit different in your case.
I mean, you summarize it. Je le dis en français.
Ah, excuse me. Yeah, you can answer in French. Sorry.
Je vais partir en anglais. Évidemment que pour.
Of course, for a very large side company with a legacy, which is rather important, well, getting back to the previous point, if I may, is there a driver to go in the public multi-cloud? No, there's no driver for the public driver, but there's a reality principle, it exists or not, and in some cases there are no public no public clouds in this country, and there's the regulation forbidding you, because we are a bank, so we come under strict regulation. In some countries we cannot operate with a public cloud, so by definition the landscape that we've got is in this scope. So why do we use the public cloud? I think that there are different ways to get there. I think that there are two approaches, those moving fast and those going further. Those who want to go further, I mean, you've got to look at the complexity of your scope, and for a company of our capacity, of our side, to understand the sum total of the regulations and how we organize ourselves to use the cloud in a secure way, led us to be very structured with our trust and control and all the framers that help us to use that safely. How do we use these public clouds, meeting the regulatory demands, our clients' demands also? Some of our customers might refuse the public clouds. In France, the French client to see his data in the public cloud in terms of banking data, I mean, is limited. So we've got to take all this into consideration in the way we build our own EC. I mean, what our clients feel like. So for the French clients, I didn't include our French clients in the public cloud. So this reality has got to be taken into consideration. The world, which is getting a little bit more complex, and I'm entering everything into the public cloud. Our reality, which is that of a bank, the regulator, and all this is an IS, and to structure that well, what do we enter into the public cloud or not is the key point. I mean, what is the right reason why, what is the business case, what is the use case, what is the reason why I'm entering this data into the public cloud. We've experienced the public cloud a long time ago now, and for us, the consumption in a lift and shift mode of the public in the public cloud doesn't work. I mean, the list and shift doesn't work, and it has no value from our standpoint. But a native cloud which is transformed, which keeps the cloud safety model and draws the maximum benefit of the cloud. Yes, for some markets it might work. Different usages. And that's the strategy and the way you're going to use the cloud usage that's going to give the landscape you have to face with your business, your regulation, your countries, etc. Thank you all, four of you, because, I mean, it gives us clearly the scope of the multi-cloud dimension. Why do we choose it? Sometimes we choose it, sometimes we don't, depending on the regulation, the country, and the size of the company. Now that we've got this kind of framework, I mean, we've introduced some notion of complexity. Which are the major challenges to be able to operate this multi-cloud? We're thinking about having multiple and diverse security models. I mean, Carlos, maybe if you have elements on that and as to how complex it is to manage those different security models. I don't want to hold the floor. I mean, my colleagues can answer also. If you look at each public cloud, they each have a security model, and you internally, you've got your own security model. So when you start using the public cloud, you've got your own security model that is going to be relevant and consistent with the public cloud security model. So the complexity getting with that is how do you control, how do you implement your own security model? I mean, we made the choice as we have two public clouds to define this security model and make sure that our security policy is well rolled out. Two elements to control when you go into the public cloud: security and compliance. We've got some compliance rule. The trust and control, as we see it, is a sum total of the security issues linked with our operation. We've got other elements of complexity to deal with. Every time you go in the public cloud, you've got the security model, and you've also got the specificity. Each of them have got different specificity. The possibility to source expertise and skilled people familiar with Azure or the Google Cloud means that there's an extreme complexity when you want to manage and to have internally the expertise of all these clouds. So security models, the difficulty to get the necessary skills and competence. The more you multiply the number of clouds, the higher the price. A huge price of all those clouds. And if you start thinking about the data that you're going to enter into the public cloud and thinking about the use case, if you haven't thought about the architecture data, there's a complexity on how you're going to find the use case with data going in Cloud 1, Cloud 2, and Cloud 3, or even in your internal one. So the complexity lies with these 4 points. So you mentioned this notion of competence skills.
About the developer, the engineers, and the team. And maybe, Donny, do you have any maybe experience on that, or how to have the right skills for that? Is it complex to have them?
Sure, yes, and that's probably, in the end, one of the highest costs and expenses involved with it. When we start looking at architecting across this, as we're talking about the different security models for multiple cloud environments. Now, what typically, it's, first of all, you have to have that higher level architectural view of on your own team as far as the overall security requirements and models across those, but then to actually implement your own security architecture in each of them, you now require security experts, that engineers that can actually implement those, that higher level architecture that you've created. And for when you throw on top of that the different levels of security, different tiers of security you may need in each one of those providers, because various data requirements or application requirements, that you really start multiplying the expertise required. And some of it will depend on your reasons. So if you're going to one cloud provider for more secure applications, so you're engineering that to a specific requirement versus another one that's maybe you're using for more general use, that's a little easier to deal with. If you're having to try to architect multiple tiers of security across 3 or 4 public clouds, and you have your own internal private cloud as well, that can get quite complex. And just hiring, I'd say, and it's not just finding the engineers then, it's retaining them and that expertise. You know, it's one thing to go out and find them, it's another thing to retain them and keep them.
Okay, so thank you. And the next level after skills is how to organize maybe ourselves or the company in order to tackle this multi-cloud complexity. So it's also maybe a matter of organization and governance. And maybe, Tobias, do you have any experience or example of this kind of complexity related to organization and governance?
I do think that keeping your own organizational governance model is key, because it's not only security, and I fully agree with Carlos, that the more cloud providers you use, the more security models you are confronted with, but it's also the more type of invoices you are getting, or the more SLA reporting you are getting, or whatever, right? So if you believe that an average large organization will probably have 100, 200, maybe 1,000 different cloud services in a few years, not only the big ones, the small ones, two-factor authentication as a service, payment as a service, a little HR tool as a service, a little marketing tool as a service. Can you imagine how complex it becomes to stay on top from an architectural point and a security point of view? And each cloud provider, especially the mature ones, will give you their governance model and their first level support models and their payment and invoicing models. And these models are very mature. But if you have 3, it's getting a little bit more complex. And if you have 10, it is getting quite a challenge. So I think what is really relevant is that first, you define very clearly what kind of responsibility stays with you, and you are not accepting that you have to adopt to a cloud provider model. And secondly, you have to define a use case and a business case that is so heavy that it outweighs the cost of implementing a new cloud service provider. It's a wrong approach to say this cloud service is cool, it has some advantages, it's good for HR. You have to make sure that what you're getting is such a big advantage that the security and operation cost, the cost of managing this additional provider, is much less. And otherwise, don't use it, because it will get into a very chaotic and very difficult and very risky situation, because you either get into a security problem or you get into a cost problem. That's what we can see worldwide at the moment.
OK. Nous avons parlé un peu de complexité.
We spoke about complexity as far as the competence is concerned, different security model, the governance issue, and the organizational issue. If we move on to the run part, how do we operate? And there's one subject to do with investigation, forensic diagnosis. I mean, how does it work? How can I supervise things? That adds on to the complexity, which is not necessarily a very easy subject. Okay, yes, now we're moving on to the security operations domain. What we find in a SOC, what we can say as a preamble is that a lot of those operations are based on security logs, which are data elements that we handle, or that are handled by the security teams. The difficulty is that as far as the American cloud suppliers, I mean, they haven't had any convergence on this. And we faced, for the security teams, to have a dual issue. First of all, the paradigm has changed, because now we're in the cloud domain. We're talking about using applications more than infrastructure. That means, as far as the security teams, they've got to think differently. So there's a whole topic of having been trained around this point. And parallel to that, I mean, when we've got a multi-cloud situation, we've got fragmented data which are not formatted the same, which are not standardized, and obviously that's a difficulty for us to work on this data to make it meaningful. So fortunately, we've made progress on this, because the technology is maturing. So what we are having now is that we've got some kind of consistent, some kind of convergence between the data models, so that we can get back this know-how. Very often we need to subscribe. I mean, the mode where we've got default security by log correction is not automatic. Very often we've got an extra action to recuperate this data, and we're going to find them not on infrastructure issues, but in the usage cases, we're going to base ourselves much more on the issues that we're faced with in the cloud. So to give you ideas, we're going to talk about data loss, data leaks. We're going to talk about wrong configuration, failure to change password, API keys, and we're going to ask the paradigm on this kind of usage. What remains a difficulty is to trace from end to end. They are complex attacks. I mean, there are penetrations which last for years, and through different layers of the SI, and keeping a trace finding a trace remain more difficult in the cloud. Last point, if the cloud is compromised, I mean, we say that it's no longer secure. We have incidents in the cloud, and to compromise the cloud structure has a very important impact. Thanks. One last point. There's the multi-cloud part, and we can go from one cloud provider to the next. And this reversibility element between cloud providers, as we've got a diversity of cloud supervisors, might add to the complexity. So, Carlos, do you have examples on the level of complexity when we want to use this reversibility? What consequences, what challenges does it give us? Reversibility for a security operation, one of the big issues is data processing. So very often we talk about log and incident data. There's going to be huge volumes involved, and the ingress in the cloud, the possibility to extract data represent an important cost. So reversibility brings new issues. What is the simpler is to keep two systems running for a certain time so that until the logs expire. We're talking about the log, but also detection cases and user cases, the metadata and the security global posture. I mean, all that has got to be borne in mind when we're talking about reversibility. To add on to and give you what we've tried to do, we chose two cloud providers, Yes and Pass, and not SAS. And there are two basic reasons. I mean, the first one is that when you're sticky with one of them, it's very good to have a second one. So from a strategic point of view, our capacity to keep pressure on both cloud providers for a normal size company is very interesting, almost vital, I would say. That helps us to contain the prices and to have a much higher possibility to negotiate. So keeping two cloud providers is almost elementary and necessary for our size company. But to do so, I mean, it's antinomic. It's opposed to the reason we're going into the cloud. We need to organize standards, containers. I'm not going to detail everything. I mean, the way to have some kind of reversibility in what I put in the cloud in a IaaS point of view and to shift it to the next cloud. But the reason we go to the public cloud is because we're looking for innovation. And if it's innovation, that means that it doesn't exist on the other side. When it becomes complicated is with use cases. I mean, the most profitable ones of them, and we're going to look for something highly differentiating in one specific public cloud. The problem is that we don't have an awful lot of them. And the use cases that we've seen in the public clouds, which are interesting, are those where there's a high usage volatility. So that's quite simple to set at standards. So when you're dealing with topics which are to do purely with the compute storage IS, the standard is very interesting because it allows us for this reversibility. It allows us to keep the capacity, and we've seen that on several occasions with our cloud suppliers. Second topic, which is important, is somehow we're talking about reversibility, but reversibility is necessary for us as a company, but our regulators are demanding. DORA is going to demand it. The DORA regulation will impose some company to have reversibility on the public clouds. So independently as to whether they're operational on the second one, you've got to have your reversibility plan. And to have your reversibility plan in a public cloud, you've got to think about whether you can resource. It depends how far you've gone to the public cloud, or public cloud B has got to be able to take over part of the activity you put in the other one. Reversibility and standardized capacity to go to the public cloud is necessary from a strategic point of view, but also from a regulatory point of view for companies which are highly regulated.
Maybe Donny, reversibility topic or example you want to share?
So I guess from my point of view, it's one of those, it's very, like with most technology, it's far easier to put it in than to pull it back out. That's what I've seen personally. The idea of being able to move from one cloud provider to another, I haven't worked with that directly, moving a particular service from one provider to another. I can imagine it could get quite tricky.
Yeah, sure. Tobias, any reaction or?
Well, I think it will get more and more difficult because If we talk about infrastructure as a service, the providers will do everything to prevent this. Okay, there is a price competition between AWS, Google, and Azure, but what they are doing is they are adding a lot of very interesting microservices around their big services. So the cost to move to another provider is getting very high. It is possible on infrastructure as a service, but the costs are very high. Whereas if I look at most of my customers, like hospitals, they get their cloud services from machines, from Philips. There is no alternative, right? And the gas pipeline I was mentioning very at the beginning, they were going on infrastructure as a service. They were encrypting from the virtual machine level. So yes, of course, they could do the transition, but it took them 1 or 2 years to set it up really well, have the real good managed cloud service providers from Italy. So until everything was set up, all the firewalls, all the internet, the encryption, the SAP system and whatever, it was a huge project with huge cost. And to change that is quite an effort. So what I think is that the SaaS services will grow massively, and these services come with specific features, exactly the features I want, and then the competitors do not have these features. So it's green, but I want it red. And everybody that uses this service in my company want it green. So how can you change to red? I mean, I'm giving a stupid example, but it's the features of a specific service, the reason why you're going there. And of course, every cloud provider tries to be very specific and give a very specific value proposition. So I think we have to understand that there will be a dependency on cloud providers. The dependencies we see at the moment, like coming from Microsoft, where you put Azure together with O365 and you have no chance, which is a monopoly. I think we have to get over that, probably from a regulatory point of view. I hope the European Union will react at a certain point in time. But all the rest will stay. I'm pretty sure. You want a Porsche, you get a Porsche. The Toyota is cheaper and electric. Well, you don't have a Porsche.
Yes.
If I may just to add, je refais en français.
I'll go back to French. I agree with you, and that's what I was saying earlier. Are you going for innovation? The service, do you understand what is the added value? Because the public cloud, the advantage is the fact that you will have more and more added services. And the other way around, and it's true in banks as well as the weather, for example, we have tables of calculation tables, and with tens of thousands of machines to try and calculate our risks. You know, banks have a daily calculation of risks, even real time. So tens of thousands of machines. So we could say, I'm going in this cloud or this supplier, and the cost is so high, but the easy use commodity is so simple. And the standard, the question is, can we distinguish between what we're paying for? The standard that we have put in place, every year we ask again, do I put my computer in Mr. X, Y, or Z? It's not even about the public cloud. We can do even cheaper with other suppliers outside. So the question about what is the standard that I put in place to consume the compute and the storage allows some kind of reversibility. So the question of norm and standard that are imposed in your company for some of your capacities allow you to give you some flexibility. The real question is when you decide to go in a public cloud, and this public cloud brings you a certain service where it's clear that there is an added value for your company, then you're paying and you're conscious of what you're paying. What is a bit difficult, a lot more difficult, you're talking about Office 365 and Azure, is that suddenly you don't have a hand on it anymore. It's gone in a certain way. ChatGPT will come with it, and you don't have a hand on it because the user is coming from outside. You're not able to manage it. Your capacity to define the norm is really what allows you to keep a hand on a referee between left and right. Innovation will still remain something very interesting, but that's why we're going in the public cloud as well.
Is the biggest driver, right? My hospital clients told me until before the pandemic, never ever. They had a red card that was that big. Patient data, no. And then suddenly they said, well, Philips is selling us these machines, and they have a cloud and artificial intelligence, and they match our blood values with million other blood values. So you have better data for your patients, and suddenly they are getting a little bit weak. And I completely agree to Carlos that what is really the nice thing is that cloud providers constantly, normally improve their services. They add little features that are really cool. But that's again the good and the evil. Some of these features might be cool, but you don't want them. So coming from a bank point of view, for example, a colleague of mine told me that it took him 6 months to convince the labor union of his banking IT environment, a very large organization, that Teams is acceptable. And everybody was happy, and under certain specific frameworks, they were allowed to implement that. And 6 months later, the labor union came to him furious and accused him of being not transparent because they found out that Microsoft has implemented, I'm not doing Microsoft bashing, it's just an example, right? Has implemented a new feature with facial recognition in Teams so that you can jump to recorded sessions and find the places where Carlos is speaking, which is really cool. From a GDPR point of view, it's not cool. Yeah, you don't want it. And my friend said it was really embarrassing for me because I tried to get that organization into these new tools. I negotiated between Microsoft and the labor union, and we find a good balance. And suddenly I'm the bad guy because I didn't tell them early enough that things are changing because, as Carlos said, I don't have the hand on it. I need to read these updates, these weekly updates, very, very carefully to find out if there is a specific feature going to disappear or a new feature which is really cool, but maybe an additional risk. And I think that is what cloud management what makes cloud management such a challenge and such an expensive thing to do.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Et alors, du coup, c'est une bonne transition parce qu'on...
Thank you very much. And it's a good transition because we saw in the challenges that there's a compromise between innovation, and that's the idea of going for innovation with the cloud providers, but there's the risk of being dependent on these services. So are there perhaps solutions or best practices to allow us to have a balance between the trade-off between the being benefiting from innovation and perhaps being less dependent? And perhaps Donny, on this side, as you were preparing the roundtable, you were talking about a few of these things, perhaps.
Yes, and I think from my view, a lot of it, and I guess there's a big difference in my thinking between somewhere where I'm doing software as a service versus truly having a multi-cloud environment. And when we're getting into the multi-cloud environment, I'm looking at how do I create that overall internal architecture in a way that is as agnostic as possible for these various clouds. Now that requires me to have a high-level architectural expertise that understands the security capabilities and weaknesses of each of those cloud providers, so that then I can fashion my security requirements around that and my architecture. But then I've got to have the very detailed implementation, because when it comes to actually implementing your security architecture on each of these cloud providers And it can get very, it could require a lot of very low-level understanding of how they operate. There's no like button you push, it says secure this cloud provider, right? And you get down and it kind of goes into those features, because in this case, it's security features that are added or changed. And now you've got to make sure you're keeping up with your security implementation in that particular cloud environment when that occurs. So I think it's having that overall, first of all, having an overall security architecture that also takes into account the different types of data classification, different security requirements for each of your apps, and then figuring out now how do I implement those particular requirements that I have in each given cloud provider. And it may be that one of them you can't meet the particular security requirements for this particular application in Cloud A. So you may have to then put it in Cloud B based upon that, right? But you should have that framework in place when you're dealing with a multi-cloud environment where you have your overall architecture and you're mapping your specific data requirements, your application requirements to the security capabilities of those various environments.
Okay, thank you. And Carlos, vous avez mentionné aussi.
Carlos, you talked about some norms and standards, and obviously there's also something relating to logs and traces. For Vincent, perhaps this allows us to create some homogeneity between these elements. Yes, as we were saying earlier, there is hope on these operational procedures. In terms of logs and traces, there are two big categories. First is the basic data for the logs. So the existing standards for the Techno on-prem were enriched to take into account new specificities. So I can mention, for instance, CIM, which allows to take the norm and to normalize it, the standard, and normalize it, and CF in ArcSight and HP, Leaf in QRadar, and all these formats allow you to take some information from the multi-cloud and try and structure it. This is from the data point of view. The next problem, it's based on use cases. How can we model the security alerts that will be launched? And we have more and more demands from our clients to have a system that is agnostic, that allows us to have reversibility, to look at different clouds. So we look at Sigma rules that are quite used. There's SPL and Splunk that's used. So we have more and more specific elements where we can use detection tools that come from the cloud, and we will put all of these logs and alerts together in one posture of detection, which will be quite unique. As we were saying earlier, these create new challenges, but obviously there isn't just one standard at the moment. I was looking at the way we were discussing this round table, and we're talking about all difficulties with the public cloud or the cloud, but it's a huge opportunity, and perhaps we should look at it the other way around. And it will be here, it will stay there, and it will really shape the way we work. And so what we have to ask ourselves is, how can we structure it the best way to take most advantage of the innovation potential that's really incredible? So at the base of this is to really be clear on all the risks in terms of compliance, security. And I was thinking, what are some of the security violations or flaws that are on the public cloud? And for most of them, they're not really flaws of the public cloud, they're just bad implementations of the public cloud. As we were saying earlier, We didn't have the relevant expertise to understand how these services work. We left some developers with little experience use services. And so we found that we had data that was exposed in the cloud. So it's really a great tool. And the real question is, are we able to manipulate this tool in the best possible way and take the best part of it for our companies, for our organization? And that's the risk that we have to balance. So I don't want to go against it. So I don't want to say I want to stop going in the public cloud. No, we should go even more into it. We have to train our teams. We have to structure them. We have to have a holistic approach to understand why are we going in the public cloud. And we have to be conscious, obviously, of the risks that it can bring. And sometimes these are risks that we take without even being aware of them. So on one hand, these are the standards that you put in place with your teams, but also the controls and the checks. So the real question is, do you have the standards in place? And are you going to check whatever you're putting in the public cloud in terms of respecting the security norms and the regulations? And as Monsizo would say, is it secure by design? So I encourage you perhaps more in this direction, looking at the cloud more with a positive attitude, because we have a lot to gain from it.
The reason why the cloud is growing that much is not only because we are pushed into it, it is very attractive. So let's take another example. It could be very attractive to become a private pilot and be able to fly little planes on the weekend. So this is very risky and very attractive. How we approach it? Well, we go to a school, we learn it, we have trainings, we invest a lot of time, we learn a lot of pages, we do exams, then finally we are allowed to fly it, and we always keep ourselves updated what is changing with the plane, and we have to be reassessed and do tests every year. So it is more or less the same with cloud, with two differences. One difference is that nobody is asking us whether we would like to use the cloud. It's here, it's there, it will be like that. And the second thing is, nobody has the chance to think, do I have enough time and resources to do it? Now, I know no company that has enough resources to manage multi-cloud, at least right now. Maybe in France it's different, but I have not seen any. Also the big ones, always too little resources. They all have too many projects, and it's very difficult to get that know-how from the market at the moment. So what do you do if you have a risky, very challenging situation with little resources? You cut the elephant until you can eat it. So you have draw down the expectations and start small scale. You define the use case, you define the business case, you implement a cloud center of excellence, you implement a first governance structure with decision-making processes. You define clear models of shared responsibilities, because the cloud provider does not deliver everything what you need. So you need to add services on top, value-added services. Which are the ones that are most important for you? Is it first-level support? Is it financial management? Is it technical support? Are you doing the change management, the incident management, the disaster recovery? You will get a long list of tasks that you want to do, and it's very clear you can't do them all right now. So you do a roadmap. You take the most important ones, the most urgent ones, and you try to invest money, time, resources, people, trainings into these elements to make them available. And the next ones in 6 months or in 12 months. And if you have enough resources, you can do it faster, or you can take a little bit more time. That's the way how I think all organizations need to approach that challenge of limited resources, but a train that is running already very fast.
Thank you. Peut-être Vincent, et puis ensuite on va avoir un peu de temps pour prendre.
Vincent, perhaps, and then we'll have some questions. Yes, I wanted to go back on the idea on the ray of light before the end of the round table. We didn't talk about the new possibilities. For example, the request that we have is to have an elastic system that can scale up and when we have abnormal phenomenons so that we're able to face these. Also, in terms of capacity of calculation and resource allocation, we talk about machine learning and behavioral, and this really opens up new horizons to have more elements for our work and security. So definitely there's a lot of positive, obviously. I hope that this exchange, this roundtable was allowed us to have a clear idea on the multi-cloud, and we have a bit of time. We have 8 minutes to take some questions. I don't know if some of you in the hall want to ask questions.
Oui, alors, ouais, ça marche. Je vous l'amène, désolé. Alors.
I'm bringing you the microphone. Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting dialogue. We talked earlier about IIS service platform. With use of cloud, we have more SAS and SAS exchanges. I wanted to know, what is your vision of security on these kinds of exchanges that are difficult to control, especially because we don't have enough vision and logs on this service? SAS. Yes, on the subject of logs, I can give you some ideas. Machine to machine, because that's the kind of exchange we're talking about. When I was saying earlier, everything will depend on the analysis of risk that we want to address and the use cases that we will put in front of this to detect this. These create problems, and this has been there for a while, though. So we've had some more extensive use cases that require us to work on standardization and map the risks and use cases to be more pertinent.
Answer the question, is okay? No? Est-ce qu'il y a une autre question?
Are there any other questions in the room?
Moi, j'ai une question par rapport.
I have a question. I will be a bit rude. We talked about costs earlier. Is there also a fine FinOps aspects? So to be able to measure a little bit the cost of multi-cloud, to have a clear vision of the different costs spent on different cloud provider solutions that your companies, is there a complexity linked to this? And are there elements of a solution to help other businesses to measure these costs in a more homogeneous way, perhaps?
I'm going to give only a very short answer. I think what we can expect is providers that will deliver add-on services that support exactly these kind of questions. And there are providers outside in the world, especially regarding licensing managing or cost managing, that they're delivering a certain aspect of managed cloud service provider solutions, right? But to conclude, a banking customer of mine, he recently said, I expect that the cost of managing Microsoft Teams is factor 50 of the Teams license. Now, Teams is not too expensive in the package, but factor 50 is quite a big number, 50-fold. And I think he's right. Managing Teams in a complex environment with people outside the company, maybe exchanging documents as well, is exposing a security and a GDPR risk, and you need to implement all kind of measurements, and that is not free of charge. It will cost resources of your IT organization. So I think, yes, the costs that are on top of cloud service licensing is completely underestimated at the moment. Carlos, what is your point on it?
Well, Absolutely. As a bank, I've already said it a few times, we're very standardized, and we have our staff is very standardized. So any exchange between some operators, whatever this exchange may be, phone, Teams, everything has to be recorded. We have to be able to reproduce to our supervisors any exchange in order to avoid any kind of malicious operations within the system. We have to be able to reproduce these elements. So as you can imagine, if you introduce Teams, you are forced to structure the recording capacities of all the interactions of whatever bank you're dealing with. Even worse, if you send a document in Teams with a link, you have to be able to look at all the links linked to this, all the documents linked to this. So the question of multiplication of tools and exchange tools really creates a whole other level of cost as well. But what do we feel? What is the alternative? There is no alternative. And luckily, we've had Teams and Zoom during COVID. Companies would have died otherwise. But we have the same debate. So the question as to, are these tools bringing a new cost to the company? Yes, of course. I don't know if we are aware of the consequences of COVID and remote workers and how the company and the collaborator is working, but it's a number of possibilities that are quite exceptional. And perhaps it's the same discussion we were having earlier regarding the cloud, to take the example of Teams, that it's a tool. And we have to understand the wholesomeness of the tool and how it's integrating into the business and into your regulation. And I agree with Tobias. It brings a new cost, and we have to be aware of this, because if you don't control it, you'll discover it later. So I share completely Tobias's remark. It has to be regulated, but it's a huge opportunity.
We
started talking about the cost part of it. For several years ago, I was in the kind of the cutting edge of the security automation orchestration field when that was starting to take off, and I was asked to do a lot of presentations on it. And I'd always start the presentation with, why are you doing the automation? Why are you doing orchestration automation? If it's to save money, leave, because that's not what you're going to do. Stop now. It's not about saving the money. It is because of all those other costs. Sure, the costs are worth it if you know what they are going in. And a lot of times what I found, and it's the same thing, is that these new technologies are first pushed as a cost savings, and you really got to push back on that, because there's a lot of, you have to understand your own business and what the costs are to it. For instance, we talked earlier about having the multiple experts in each of these clouds. It's the ongoing training of these multiple experts in these clouds. It's all of the other business processes, the governance processes and that you're going to have to put on top of it. That's the larger cost typically. And I think a lot of times it's given, unfortunately, people, I think, try to put together a business case that looks good, that shows a cost savings, when in actuality, in the long run, it probably won't be. And that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it for the business benefit, the innovation benefit. That's what's driving it, not cost.
Merci beaucoup. Donc,
Thanks a lot. I mean, we're getting to the end of this session. Dead on time. Well, I would like to thank Carlos, Vincent, Denis, and Tobias. Thanks a lot for your presentation. And thanks to you remotely viewing this on the multi-cloud, and have a nice session. Thank you.